Jalen Brunson is having a breakout playoff run, and I'm here to break it all down. All that and much more on the Knicks Digest. What's up, guys? It's your boy Dariel from Knicks Digest. So the other day, I'm listening to one of the many podcasts that I listen to, and this one in particular, I'm going to be talking about Gilgeous-Alexander, the Gilbert Arenas show that he has on YouTube. And one of the segments, they start talking about Jalen Brunson and his play as of late in the playoffs, and how he's just taking over New York, and how he's put the team on his back, and he's showing everybody how much of a good player he is, just exceeding expectations, and how he could become one of the better Knicks of all time. And then they start talking about the other playoff series, and they end up talking about the Oklahoma City Thunder going up against the Dallas Mavericks, which then they go into talking about SGA. And then Josiah Johnson, who's the host of that podcast show, brings up the question, who is the better player and who would you have on your team, SGA or Jalen Brunson? Now, before I break down the stats and before I give my personal pick, but you guys obviously know who I'm going to go with, it's just interesting to me how Gilbert Arenas, a few months ago, he was on his show saying how the New York Knicks would trade for Jalen Green from the Houston Rockets. Let me repeat that. Gilbert Arenas on his show, Gilgeous-Alexander, said that the Knicks would trade for Jalen Green from the Houston Rockets, a player who has not shown anything in his career as of yet, a player who's been known as a good stats, bad team kind of guy, but the Knicks would trade important pieces of their team for that player. And now Gilbert Arenas kind of has changed his tune in saying how Jalen Brunson is one of the best Knicks of all time. He's giving Jalen Brunson his flowers. He's giving Jalen Brunson praise. So we're just going to ignore that, but whatever. Now, going into the actual segment and going into the actual question that Josiah Johnson raised, going around the panel between Brandon Jennings, Kenyon Martin Sr., Gilbert Arenas, and Rashad McCants. Kenyon Martin picked SGA, Gilbert Arenas picked SGA, Brandon Jennings picked Brunson, and Rashad McCants picked Brunson. They all went into how their game is kind of similar. They kind of really depend on their mid-range game. Jalen Brunson and SGA, they do such a good job of like lulling the defender to sleep with all of the dribble moves. The dribble moves that they do in the isolations is different than James Harden. Because James Harden back in the day, specifically when he was in the Houston Rockets, James Harden would be at the top of the key taking 30 dribbles to go into his crossover step back three. And those 30 dribbles would take the offensive flow away from his other teammates. And I hated watching him play. And to this day, James Harden, I'm just not a fan of his, which is probably one of the reasons why they're out of the playoffs. But Jalen Brunson and SGA, they do have a little bit of that in their game, where whenever they are on isolation, whenever they are on an island and they're dribbling to set up their shot, one, they're not taking 30 dribbles. Two, it's more of a quick decision going into their move, which is something that I really, really respect from the two. But then after they break down the defender with their isolation, they really get into their mid-range game. And then Jalen Brunson, his footwork is Kobe-esque, if you ask me, in my opinion. But SGA, low-key, has great footwork. Just yesterday, when the Dallas Mavericks won in Oklahoma City in Game 3, there was a move where SGA, I believe he had maybe Josh Green at the top of the key, and SGA went into his a la Harden-esque type bag where he was at the top of the key and he was bringing the defender down, lulling them to sleep. And then he spun off him. He gave a super nice pump fake where the defender bit and he jumped, and then SGA did a nice up and under move. So SGA has immaculate footwork in his bag. And SGA and Jalen Brunson, they don't rely on their three-point shot. They do understand that the mid-range is still a very important part of the game. And if you're able to break your defender down, and if you're able to get to the basket as close as possible, you're going to have a higher percentage from the field. Now, going into the actual numbers between these two players, it's very interesting to me how these numbers broke down. So for these playoffs, I'm talking about the playoffs. I'm not talking about the regular season. I am talking about specifically for these playoffs. You take a look here at the numbers. Jalen Brunson in the 9 games of the 2024 playoffs so far, his numbers break down to 34.6 points, 7.9 assists, and 3.9 rebounds. Now, if you're looking into more specifics for his numbers, I'm looking at specifically the field goal percentage. So for the playoffs, he is averaging 12.2 field goals made, and that is on 27.2 field goal attempts. And that equates to 44.9, which is 45% from the field. 45% from the field is absolutely ridiculous. Now let's look into the 3-point field goal percentage. He makes about 2.2 3-pointers per game on 6.9, which is 7 3-point attempts per game. Now that equates to 32.3 3-point percent. Now in today's NBA's game, as far as being a 3-point shooter, I think that if you're anywhere from like 37, 38% up until like 42, 43%, I consider that a really good 3-point shooter. And to look at Jalen Brunson's 3-point numbers again, it breaks down to about 32.3%. So that's definitely an area where Jalen Brunson can improve. And now if we take a look into SGA's numbers, SGA for this playoffs, once again, is for the playoffs. We're not talking about the regular season. In the 6 games he's played, it breaks down to 28.5 points, 7.5 rebounds, and 6.2 assists. And before I break it down even further, the reason why SGA has 6 games in comparison to Jalen Brunson's 9 games is because the first round for SGA, he was going up against the New Orleans Pelicans where they swept them in 4 games. And in the first round for the New York Knicks going against the 76ers, they actually took 6 games in order to advance. So now let's break down the numbers for SGA more specifically. So just like I did with Jalen Brunson, we're going to be looking at the field goal percentage and the 3-point percentage. So let's take a look at SGA's field goal percentage. So SGA, he is making 10.2 field goal makes on 21.2 field goal attempts, which equates to 48%. So SGA is basically shooting 50% from the field, which again is absolutely ridiculous. Now, 3-pointers. 3-pointers, SGA is averaging 1.3 makes on 4 attempts, which equates to 33.3%. The numbers with SGA and Jalen Brunson is kind of scary how identical they are. And I mean, at the same time, it kind of makes sense just because of how they play the game. Like I said in the beginning of the video, they do know that the 3-point shot is a very important shot in today's NBA game, but they don't rely on it. They rely on what they know. And what they know is breaking down the defender in the mid-range, using their immaculate Kobe Bryant footwork to break down the defender and make the game as easy as possible. Now, going back to the Gilbert Arenas show, Kenyon Martin and Gilbert Arenas, they chose SGA. Brandon Jennings and Rashad McCants, they chose Brunson. But Kenyon Martin and Gilbert Arenas, the main reason why they chose SGA over Brunson is because of the height difference. So if we take a look into the height difference, Jalen Brunson measures at 6'2", whereas SGA measures at 6'6". And I mean, they kind of do have a point. SGA being 6'6" gives him the physical advantage over most point guards in the league. SGA is 6'6". Like, I mean, he's not muscular. He's definitely not hefty. But with that height, there are multiple opportunities just to shoot over the defender. And most of the time, since SGA is 6'6", the opposing team is not going to put their point guard on SGA. They're going to put more of a defensive perimeter player on SGA. And when I'm recording this, it's just one day after the NBA MVP was announced, and it was Jokic from the Denver Nuggets winning his 3rd MVP in 4 seasons. And SGA was heavily considered, and a lot of people thought that he was actually going to win the MVP award, but it didn't break down, but it didn't end up being that way. But if we take a look into the actual numbers, I have them right here, the voting results, if you will. So we know Jokic won with 79 first place votes, but who was second in total points as far as voting results? SGA came in second. If you take a look at the first place votes, SGA came in with 15. Second place votes, SGA had 40, I believe, where Jokic had 18. And then on this ballot, we do see Jalen Brunson's name. Jalen Brunson ends up being 5th. And if we take a look at the votes, on his first place votes, he ended up getting 0. And his second place votes, he ended up getting 3. For total points for the voting results, he ended up getting 142. Now, in my opinion, Jalen Brunson ending up being 5th on the MVP voting results is kind of disrespectful. You got to take into account how Jalen Brunson did not have this, in some people's eyes, the second best player on the team or the first player, depending on who you talk about, in Julius Randle. Julius Randle went out with that dislocated shoulder, I believe, on January 27th. And from January 27th on, the offensive responsibilities was heavily relied on Jalen Brunson's shoulders. Seeing how Julius Randle went out on January 27th with that injury, a lot of the defensive schemes that the opposing teams were drawing up were to shut down Jalen Brunson, whether that be double teams, whether that be blitzes, whether that be whatever defensive scheme the opposing coach drew up, it was for Jalen Brunson to be shut down. So if you take that into account and you see where the New York Knicks ended up at the season, they ended up as a 2nd seed with 50 wins, I believe. How is Jalen Brunson ending up as the 5th player on the MVP voting results? That I'm not sure I'll be able to answer, but as far as the future of the league, it's definitely in good hands with SGA, with Jalen Brunson, as well as many other players, not just point guards, but just players in general, Luka Doncic, Jokic, Anthony Edwards, Zion, Ja, the list goes on and on. But that segment talking about Jalen Brunson and SGA on the Gilbert Arenas show, it just really got me to think about how similar these two players are and how they're going to be battling for best point guards in the league for years to come. And I'm super here for it. SGA, I love watching his game. I love watching players play the game the right way and not solely depending on one skill or one aspect of the game. I'm talking about the three-point shot. So many teams, so many players, it seems like they kind of forget how to play and they solely rely on the three-point shot. A lot of teams, they devise their offensive scheme around the three-pointer, where the mid-range game still exists, the post-up game still exists. And I understand the NBA's game now. The NBA game in today's world is very up and down, very fast-paced, and obviously the NBA wants it to be an attractive game, but you still have to rely on the fundamentals of the game, whether that's footwork, whether that's ball handling, whether that's post-game, whether that's basketball IQ. And as far as basketball IQ, footwork, the fundamentals of the game, SGA and Jalen Brunson, they are one of the brighter spots of the game, of the league, of the future. But that's it for today's video, guys. I want to say thank you so much for checking it out. Let me know and leave it in the comments. Who would you be rolling with? After all the numbers that I gave you, after all the numbers that I broke down, and you saw Jalen Brunson's numbers from this playoff run, and you saw SGA's numbers from this playoff run, who are you rolling with? Who do you think the better player is? Is it SGA or is it Brunson? Let me know in the comments. But until next time, you know the drill. You know the vibes. Taj Gibson for president, wherever you are. Jalen Brunson for MVP, for all the MVPs. The deuce is loose. Deuce for co-MVP. And until next time, guys, I'll check you out on the next video. Peace. Go Knicks, baby.